Hi, this is Dr. Hudson. This presentation is designed to help you master the historical thinking skill using primary source evidence. Here I've listed the 6 historical thinking skills that we'll focus on in this course. This helps you put this particular skill in a broader context. Where does all the stuff in the history textbooks come from? Is there an official history for a nation? Are there official historians, people who record the official history of a nation? When we hear these common phrases, this will go down in history, or that's one for the history books, it makes you think there must be some official screening for what gets into those mysterious history books. While it might seem reasonable or even desirable, there are no official national histories or historians. This is a section division. When you reach a slide like this, the presentation will automatically stop, and you decide if you want to continue with the new section, which is titled, or if you prefer to go back and review the previous section. The central question for this skill is, how do we know what we know about the past? And the answer is, by using primary source evidence, one of the 6 historical thinking skills you will develop and demonstrate in this course. Historians, like detectives, rely on clues or evidence. They have to find the evidence and then interpret it. The clues or evidence for history is referred to as a primary source. Primary source evidence can be many things. It can be written, which is the most common, but it can also be oral. It can also be visual. It can be still images as in photos, or it can be a moving image. It can be formal, issued from a government, or it can be informal, a private diary, an exchange of letters between friends. It can be public. There can be records of it and you can go find them. Or it can be private, found in someone's attic. It can be direct or indirect. It can be a fully developed explanation, or it can just be a small hint. Here's a collage of various forms of primary source evidence. Just pause the presentation for a minute, take a look. You'll see a newspaper, a diary, a letter, vital statistics, census records, photos, legislation, a speech, a song, an interview. While primary source evidence can be many things, the key criteria that makes these many things evidence is that 1, they were created in the time period studied, and 2, by people in the time period studied. Try this quiz. Having covered the criteria for what is primary source evidence, I want to make sure you know what is not primary source evidence. A textbook is not primary source evidence. An essay about the historical topic is also not primary source evidence. These are both interpretations of the past that have used primary source evidence. These are known as secondary sources. This section defines the skill basics. All historical thinking skills involve asking questions. Using primary source evidence requires asking questions that will help you identify, evaluate, and infer. We'll begin with identify. When you have a primary source, you want to first identify what type of primary source it is. And you can return to the list for examples of primary source evidence. And then you want to identify the author of the evidence. And then asking questions about the author's purpose in creating. Who was the intended audience? When was this evidence created? What was the context? So a series of questions about the primary source itself. Beyond acquiring information about the primary source, we'll need to ask questions about its reliability and evaluating that. To what degree can you trust the evidence? It'll be important to evaluate the author's point of view. How is that point of view reflected in the evidence? And evaluating claims made by the evidence and not accepting them simply at face value. This last skill is the most subtle because it involves inferring information that's not directly stated, particularly information about the emotional content, things that are implied in the wording, perhaps, the tone. And then, what information does this primary source give us that was not even intended? When you think about it, you'll realize that you use these skills all the time in daily communication. This section adds complexity to the skill basics. Using primary source evidence is essential, yet primary source evidence also requires interpreting it in the context of its historical background. Primary source evidence is always incomplete because it's only one component of a much larger story. Even if you were interpreting hundreds or thousands of primary sources, these would still need to be understood in a broader context. That broader context is provided by secondary sources. Thus, primary sources are always interpreted with secondary sources as a guide. And the secondary sources could be a wide variety of things, including a textbook, a number of books written by historians, lectures are secondary sources, or any information from an expert in the field. This section offers a concluding mantra. Always remember, history is not learning facts. Historical thinking, in this case using primary source evidence, requires that you think, that you ask questions, that you make judgments that require reasoning, and that you explain those judgments. Yet historical thinking is not simply issuing opinions, which are personal preferences, but historical thinking leads to interpretations. Interpretations that reflect a point of view that can be challenged and disputed. History is controversial.